could get us started and in good philosophical fashion, that I would ask a definitional question of everyone. What is sublime experience, or what is a sublime experience?
Well, I'm glad you asked it that way, because when I did my work on the sublime, it became clear to me that not everyone agrees that there is a sublime experience, but I do feel that there is one. So I like the way that your question is biased towards my position, if we have positions. Some people think that the sublime is just a language game, what Wittgenstein would call a language game, a way of talking about a certain class of experiences that we decide to label that way, a rhetorical trope. But most sublime theorists up to the 20th century clearly thought there was an experience of the sublime and something that you could feel before there was ever a word for it. And I guess that that's what I feel, just to start with, that it is an experience. And it's an experience of, for me, in brief, when you realize palpably, when you realize viscerally in your body, as well as with all of your acting mind, that the world is greater than you have ever supposed, than you can take in with your senses and with your cognition. It's an experience that's both cognitive and emotional and very powerful. And my guess is that many in this room feel that they have had such an experience. I know that I have.
I too think that there is certainly a sublime experience. I think that the terms for it have varied in history, and that the sublime experience as the response initially in a state of fear, then in a state of recovery, and in a certain sense after that, a state of possession, that is to say, possession of the experience, but at the same time possibly being possessed by the experience, I think flourishes particularly in the 18th century. The term sublime applies most recognizably to that experience then. And that as one moves into the 19th century, partly owing to Kant's third critique, but perhaps not so much of influence as, you know, the zeitgeist or whatever. In my own view, the experience or becoming aware of the imagination, that is to say, an internal faculty that one is alerted to by the experience of something almost incommensurable in the external world, replaces the sublime, and that the word sublime, as it's used in the Romantic period, becomes a little more casual. Sometimes it even means chemical sublimation, as when Byron calls a rascal, rapscallion of a lawyer, the sublime of rascals. That's a chemical term, the pure distillation of rascals. And then I think that since then, and this is something I'm going to stop and need to talk about more, I think that since then, the experience itself has become more unstable. In Freud, I think that a comparable sort of experience is the uncanny, and that's something we might want to come back to as well. And there are other aesthetic categories, as described in the 20th and 21st century, that in various ways maybe encroach on what we mean by the sublime without taking away the fact that there is such an experience. So I've gone on too much.
Well, I think from my experience as a musician, and I would venture to suggest, is that me? It seems to be that I'm growling, and I don't mean to. That perhaps the sublime is easiest to be accessed through music. That I remember my experiences as a very small child, not being aware of particularly what I was listening to, some great works of music, great choral works, great Bach. Then later realizing that music had transported me in a special way, that right up to now, I'm trying to analyze and understand. But I think that through great music, and I think we could all agree on certain pieces of great music, we can find the sublime, access the sublime.
Well,
Now you have to answer.
well, I know I have to answer my own question. I think I also agree that there is such a thing as sublime experience, and that it has a certain character to it that makes it distinctive. I also think that the term sublime, as you allude to, Paul, has become stretched in various ways to sort of take on perhaps an experience of horror or an uncanny. And actually, one of the art critics for The New Yorker, whose last name I can't pronounce very well.
Sheldon?
That's it, Peter Sheldon, said in response to an exhibit of works by Caspar David Friedrich that the sublime doesn't mean anything today, that it's been stretched too far. And so one of the things that I've actually been working on in contemporary aesthetics is to come up with some sense of the concept of the sublime, of a sublime response that has a certain shape to it and doesn't fall victim to Sheldon's charge that I think he said something like, it's the sublime has had 200 years to start meaning something coherent, and it has failed. So, but I would say that there really is a category, aesthetic category that makes sense. That is kind of a mixed, pleasurable experience. And in the 18th century, when the category came to be significantly theorized, it was seen as the kind of the whole of beauty. So beauty was seen as largely, very pleasurable, tranquil experience, often of smooth or polished, beautiful formed objects. And the sublime was seen as kind of a more painful, tumultuous experience of often formless or vast, overwhelming kinds of paradigmatically natural objects or scenes. But it seems to me that there still is a kind of experience of being overwhelmed that is both, it's painful and it's also pleasurable, that we still feel today, that answers to the concept of sublime.
If I could respond to where you started, Sandra, I don't think it's such a concern that terms and concepts get stretched out, because that's what we do, right, as language users. We try them out in new contexts and we stretch them out, as long as, it's not really a problem as long as we have central examples. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about, an examining table, and we can talk about, a massage table, but we still know that, what a table is. And this is our central example, is something like this. So if we have if everybody had a paradigmatic example of the sublime experience, that might help us. Obviously, James has already given us his. It's listening to what Mahler's Ninth or Beethoven's Ninth, and yes, and the moment when the audience comes to tears. For me, it would be being really high up in the mountains, and being able to see range after range after range of mountains all around me, and be completely unable to take it all in, and yet, sort of in awe of this. I still really like the natural sublime. Do you have a central example, Paul, or is?
I would be perfectly happy with yours, and it's interesting, of course, that in the development of landscape painting, the Dutch in particular specialized in extended prospects that were just like that, painted from a high angle, so that you saw across the flat country of Holland, through innumerable villages and spires, becoming smaller and smaller in the distance, and finally arriving at what might be the sea, but is so far away that it's difficult to tell. I certainly agree that that's a central experience of the natural sublime, on the supposition that the sublime is in the world and not in our head. I think that already we're coming to the point where the question of whether the sublime is bound very large or boundless it already becomes a matter of interest, because to speak of the shape of the sublime experience, I think, is right. The experience itself does have a shape, but the sublime, the catalyst, that which gives rise to the experience, is arguably, and it depends who you listen to, either almost infinite but still finite, that is to say, an object in the external world, or something that we think or constitute in our minds as the infinite, because of course we don't know the infinite in the external world. And this is one of the controversies about the sublime. It's very interesting that even people who, modern critics and thinkers who theorize about the sublime, seem not altogether to agree on it. There's a book by Stephen Knapp, a professor at Berkeley, called Personification and the Sublime, that supposes sublime objects, including supernatural beings, even human beings, to have a finite outline. We recognize them in the form of their personification, a device or technique that we associate with allegory. So in some sense, we can see them clearly. And in that case, if you take Milton as your sublime literary text par excellence, you'd say, well, Satan is the sublime figure, because Satan is a being that you can see, but you're mistaken if you think you know what the real extent of his magnitude is. And we can come back to that. I don't want to dwell over it for the moment. What I wanted to say for the moment was, if, on the other hand, you think of the figures of sin and death in Milton, not so much Satan, but the figures of sin and death, you see that Milton's whole point about them is that they're shapeless. That their magnitude is communicated as that which is boundless and has no form. So an underlying question for me in thinking about this, and it may have to do with the relation between the sublime and the experience, is the question of whether the sublime, as it were, has a form. Right? A pioneering thinker concerning the sublime was a Greek teacher of Roman youth preparing to enter into civic life somewhere between in the 3rd century, named Longinus. And he wrote a treatise called On the Sublime. And he distinguishes there in ways that aren't, I think, fully analogous with Kant's mathematical and dynamic, but at the same time rather interesting. On the one hand, there's the sort of power expressed by the tearing apart of the fabric of language through rhetorical devices, an opening of a gap or wound in ordinary discourse, where somehow what he calls visualization, or the experience of something arresting or terrifying from the outside, emerges. And on the other hand, he speaks also of a sublime experience that one has if one's an auditor of Demosthenes, being, as he puts it, hit over the head again and again and again and again. In other words, with Demosthenes, it's a matter of sustaining the experience of being overwhelmed. In other sorts of rhetorical experience, it's a matter of a sudden tearing apart of the fabric of the experience, which he calls persuasion, or the coherence of an argument that can be very exciting and compel us because it is coherent. But at the same time, this sort of experience tears that apart, leaving a sudden rift or gap through which, as he puts it, the experience of the sublime floods. Right?
But as I listen, I'm not clear what is the experience and what is the product that causes that experience. So when you go up on the mountain and you are looking, is that perspective, that scenario, what you are seeing, or is it what you are feeling, the sublime? And as a second question is, what is it you are feeling? If you were to, because it seems there's always a lack of sharpness to me when we say it's sublime. What is it, and what is it we feel? Is it joy? Is it awe? Is it the uncanny feeling which contains elements of some anxiety or discomfort? So my...
Yeah, it's, the mountains by themselves aren't, if nobody's there, the mountains aren't sublime, right? If the sublime is a human experience, you need a human observer to have the sublime experience. So that one's easy. The ocean isn't sublime when no one's out at sea in it, but when you have a huge wave and you're seeing it, it's sublime. That lack of definition is, this will sound like a cop-out, but I don't think it is. The lack of definition is built into the sublime because it's what eludes our categories. It's what, Keats has this lovely phrase, when he talks about how the Elgin marbles tease us out of thought. The sublime is what teases us out of thought. We can't, our well-honed, cognitive abilities are well-used, stable categories. They just fall by the wayside. It's a moment of, for me, the sublime is a moment of breakdown. And in that moment, we get this sense that the world was greater than we ever supposed. And Kant would add that, the human mind is greater than we ever supposed, because somehow, even though we can't imagine it, we can't take it in, we're still cognizing it in some odd, intuitive feeling way. So it's hard for me to know exactly what Kant means at that moment, but it's almost like we feel our way into it. We can't grasp it, but we know it's there.
Well, going back to the distinction between the sublime and the experience of the sublime in the mountains, Kant actually mentions the peasants of the Savoy, who are so acclimatized to the mountains because they live there that they have no experience of them at all. It's just their daily environment. So that what Kant is suggesting is that a certain distance from the quotidian experience of whatever it is that surrounds you is required. And in a certain sense, that, well, it isn't chemical, because if it were chemical, you're in a mountain, you're going to have the experience, and and that's that. Whereas Kant is suggesting that it must, to some extent, be a question of environmental distance and not intimacy. And that's where the element of fear, for one thing, comes in, which is so frequently associated with the first phase of the experience of the sublime. The idea is that initially, in response to something that seems overwhelming, we feel fear. But then we realize that we're not actually in danger, that it is a kind of a proxy danger, that we are, in effect, safe. We're standing at the top of the mountain, but there's the railing that the tourist industry has put in for us. And okay, fine, we're safe. And then, through a kind of recoil or retrieval of self-respect, we internalize the experience. And we feel that, in some sense, it is the result of our own emotional or cognitive power. So that, and Longinus says this too. He says the amazing thing about a great utterance is that it transports us. It puts us into an ecstasy, ecstasis. It transports us so that we imagine that we ourselves have produced the thing that we have heard. Right? So he takes you through the whole experience as well. It's like a kid watching a baseball game and swinging his little toy bat, and somebody hits a home run, and he's just so enthusiastic. He's swinging his bat. He thinks he hit the home run himself. He has, through the intensity of identification, he has this moment of thinking he did it, which is part of the excitement.